In the quiet hills of Appalachia, where old mining towns once thrived and then slowly crumbled into decay, there sat a farmhouse that never seemed to belong to the present time. The house itself was not remarkable. Peeling white paint, sagging porch, a few broken windows patched with cardboard, but stood in silence, surrounded by acres of overgrown fields that hadn't been tended in years. Locals said the place carried a heaviness, something that clung to it like a shadow. Children riding their bikes down the dirt road would speed past, never daring to look too long at the windows. The house looked empty, but everyone knew it wasn't. It was home to a family about whom people in town whispered, though no one ever dared confront them directly. Life in that region had always been harsh. Generations of families had worked the mines until their bodies gave out, their lungs blackened by coal dust. When the mines closed, many left, chasing better lives in nearby cities. Those who stayed often lived in poverty, trapped by land passed down through generations but too poor to maintain. The family in the sagging farmhouse had been there longer than most, tracing their roots back to the earliest settlers. They clung to their land with a stubbornness that wasn't unusual for the area, but what set them apart was the way they lived. Not just poor, but closed off, secretive, as though time itself had stopped for them. On the surface, they appeared to be just another struggling household. A matriarch who seldom left the house. Sons who worked odd jobs when they could find them. Daughters who never seemed to marry, who stayed close to home, raising children whose fathers were never named. To outsiders, it seemed like a family barely scraping by, struggling to survive in a forgotten corner of America. But behind those walls, something darker stirred, something that went beyond poverty or isolation. It was a silence that carried weight, as though everyone inside knew a truth they could not speak. Those who had been inside described the air as thick, almost suffocating. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the corners. The furniture was mismatched, worn, and sagging, as though it had been passed down too many times. A wood-burning stove sat in the center of the main room, always lit, filling the house with a heavy smoke that clung to everything. There was little light, and what little did filter in through the dirt-streaked windows seemed to make the shadows deeper rather than chase them away. The family members themselves carried the same worn look as the house. Their clothes were often second-hand, ill-fitting, and stained from work and time. Their faces, pale from lack of sunlight, carried lines and hollows that made them look older than their years. They didn't mingle with the rest of the town. They didn't attend church. They didn't show up at community gatherings or school functions. Their children would appear in classrooms for a time, but just as suddenly vanish, said to be kept home with no questions asked. Teachers learned not to press too hard. Social workers had visited in the past, but those visits never seemed to last. It was the isolation that allowed rumors to grow. In small towns, gossip traveled faster than truth, and in this case, both fed off each other. Some said the family was cursed. Others said they were dangerous. The most common whispers were about the children, how they all seemed to look alike, their features too close, their bloodline too tangled. People claimed they saw things, heard things, when passing by the farmhouse at night. Strange noises, laughter that wasn't laughter, cries that didn't sound like they belonged to children at all. Yet for all the talk, no one interfered. The family was poor, but they weren't criminals, not outwardly, not in a way anyone could prove. They kept to themselves, and the town allowed it. It was easier to turn away than to confront what might be festering just beyond those doors. People told themselves it was none of their business. After all, everyone had secrets. But deep down, they knew this was something different, something unnatural. The matriarch, the one who seemed to hold the family together, was a woman who carried herself with quiet authority. She had grown up in that very house, raised by parents who had lived in the same manner. By the time she had children of her own, she had already learned the unspoken rules. Loyalty to family above all else, silence about what happened inside those walls, and a complete distrust of outsiders. Her presence was commanding without ever raising her voice. The children obeyed her without question. The sons, even as grown men, still seemed like boys under her gaze. The daughters lived under her watchful eye, their lives tightly bound to the house, as if escape wasn't even a thought that could survive. From the outside, it was a life of routine. The men would hunt or scavenge for work. The women would tend to the house, the cooking, and the endless caring for children. But beneath that routine was a hierarchy built on fear and control, a system where silence was survival. Affection, if it existed, was twisted, bound in ways that blurred the lines of love and harm. The children didn't play like others did. They were obedient, watchful, cautious, like they already knew the world outside their walls was waiting to judge them. And while the family presented itself as unremarkable to anyone passing by, some cracks revealed the truth. A daughter with eyes always downcast, as though she carried shame too heavy for her young age. A son whose anger flared too quickly, violence spilling out over nothing. A child who never spoke, only stared, as if words themselves were forbidden. These small details went unnoticed by most, but for those who paid attention, they were signs that something was deeply wrong, that it was only a matter of time before those hidden truths could no longer stay buried. The silence of the farmhouse, the secrecy of the family, all of it was building towards something that could not be contained. Those who looked back would later say that the signs were always there. The unease, the whispers, the strange way that the family lived apart from everyone else. But no one imagined the extent of what was happening behind those faded walls. No one wanted to believe the truth until it was too late. The days in the farmhouse followed a rhythm that never really changed, yet beneath the surface, the tension was like a rope pulled tighter and tighter. Every small disagreement, every sideways glance seemed to carry weight, as though the walls themselves were holding secrets too heavy to contain. What had once been silence was now filled with an edge. Raised voices behind closed doors, slammed doors echoing through the halls, and an unease that never left, even in the stillness of night. The matriarch sat at the center of it all, still commanding authority, but her grip was beginning to slip. Her sons had grown into men, but men who had never really left her shadow. They resented the weight of her control, yet feared what life would look like without it. One of the older sons, known for his short temper, began to challenge her in subtle ways, talking back, questioning her decisions, even storming out, for hours at a time, leaving the others tense and silent until he returned. His anger often found its way toward his sisters, who avoided him as much as they could, knowing his moods could shift with no warning. The daughters, bound to the house in ways that felt more like a sentence than a choice, carried their silent storms. Their lives had been shaped by their mother's rule and their brother's dominance, leaving little room for dreams or independence. One of the middle daughters had once dared to speak of leaving, of finding work in town, but she had returned with her face bruised and her voice silenced. After that, no one mentioned escape again. Yet the thought lingered, especially among the younger ones, who still had enough hope left to wonder if there was a world beyond those walls. Financial struggles pressed on them like a constant weight. Odd jobs weren't enough to keep food on the table, and hunting had become more desperate as the land around them was stripped bare. They lived off little, and when outsiders came near with questions, the family grew defensive. Pride kept them from asking for help, but hunger gnawed at their resolve. That hunger made tempers shorter, patience thinner, and violence more frequent. Jealousy began to fester among the siblings. The brothers competed for their mother's approval, each one desperate to be seen as the strongest, the most loyal. The sisters, forced into roles that blurred boundaries of care and control, found themselves caught in the middle. One sister, in particular, seemed to draw more attention from the men of the house than the others. She was quiet, almost fragile, and her silence seemed to invite obsession. Her presence stirred conflict. Each glance in her direction was another spark on a pile of dry wood. The arguments about her were never spoken in full words, but they burned hot in the glares exchanged, the muttered curses, the heavy silence at the dinner table. Secrets from the past also began to seep into the present. The family had always hidden their history, but pieces of it surfaced in bitter arguments. Old grudges between brothers came up again and again. Who had been favored? Who had been punished more? Who had borne the brunt of their mother's wrath? The older ones remembered nights of fear when their father was alive, his drunken rages still fresh in their memories even years after his death. The younger ones didn't remember him at all, but they carried the scars of a household shaped by his violence. That absence became another wound, one that split them further apart instead of bringing them together. The outside world pressed in as well. Rumors in town grew louder. Teachers asking why certain children never came back to school, neighbors wondering why no one from the farmhouse ever appeared in church. A social worker came one afternoon, her car stirring dust on the dirt road as she pulled up. The family gathered silently on the porch, their faces blank, their bodies still. She asked questions they refused to answer, her eyes darting from one pale face to another. By the time she left, her expression was tight, uneasy, but she didn't return. The matriarch had a way of making outsiders feel unwelcome, and fear did the rest. But the visit had rattled the family. They knew the world was watching closer now, and that fear only deepened their need to keep secrets hidden. Among the brothers, tension grew sharper. The eldest saw himself as heir to the family, the one who would take control when their mother was gone. But the younger ones weren't willing to bow to him so easily. Fights broke out, sometimes over food, sometimes over money, sometimes over nothing at all. These weren't small arguments, but brutal, physical clashes that left bruises and broken furniture. Their mother would sit in her chair, watching, sometimes stepping in with a sharp word, letting them fight until exhaustion stopped them. Her silence was a weapon in itself. Her approval withheld until it left each son desperate to prove himself. The sisters bore the weight of these battles in different ways. Some retreated further into themselves, their eyes dull, their voices barely above whispers. Others fought back in small, quiet rebellions, taking extra food, hiding money, refusing to speak when demanded. But even their resistance came with punishment, whether from their brothers' fists or their mother's cold authority. The house became a place of constant surveillance. Each movement watched, each choice due. Gauged, each secret guarded with fear. The fragile daughter at the center of their jealousy became the breaking point. The brothers' obsession with her grew more obvious, their arguments louder, their glares sharper. She became the symbol of control, each brother believing he had more claim to her than the others. She moved through the house like a shadow, avoiding their eyes, her silence both a shield and a curse. But the more she tried to disappear, the more they saw her, the more they fought over her, the more dangerous the air inside the farmhouse became. Every night, the house filled with noise, yelling, footsteps pounding, doors slamming. The children who had once sat silent now cried, their wails echoing through the thin walls. The stove glowed in the center of it all, the only constant warmth in a house that was otherwise cold and cruel. The matriarch sat in her chair, her face unreadable, as though she was watching something inevitable unfold. She had built this world, shaped this family, and now she seemed to accept the chaos as part of what it was meant to be. The days grew darker, not just from the shortening light of winter, but from the heavy weight pressing down on everyone inside. Hunger, jealousy, old wounds, and forbidden desires twisted together until there was no clear line between right and wrong, love and violence, family and enemy. Each day felt like it might be the one where the rope finally snapped. Each night carried the sense that something was coming, something that could no longer be contained by silence or fear. The night it happened was colder than most, the kind of cold that made the farmhouse groan in the wind and sent drafts crawling under the doors. The wood stove crackled weakly in the main room, the heat it gave off swallowed by the endless chill. The family gathered as they always did, each in their place, the silence between them heavier than usual. The fragile daughter, the one who had become the center of all their storms, sat at the edge of the room with her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't look up. She rarely did anymore. The eldest son paced the floor, his boots thudding against the worn boards. His face was tight, jaw clenched, his eyes sharp with a fury that seemed to burn hotter with every step. He had been drinking, though there was little left in the house to drink. The smell of cheap liquor clung to him, mixing with the smoke of the stove. His younger brothers sat nearby, restless, their own anger barely contained. Every glance toward her was a spark. Every time her name was mentioned, it was like tossing dry wood on an open flame. The fight began with words, as it always did. Accusations slung across the room, voices raised, each brother trying to claim his right, his dominance, his piece of the fragile daughter who wanted nothing from any of them. She sat frozen, her face pale, as if her body had learned how to disappear without leaving the room. Their mother watched from her chair, her face blank, as though she had seen it all before and knew there was no stopping it. The eldest son shouted first, slamming his hand down on the table so hard the plates rattled. His words came out like poison, each one meant to wound his brothers, to make them small. The second son rose to his feet, fists clenched, his voice breaking with rage. The third pushed back his chair and stood, his breathing heavy, his eyes wild. For a moment, it was only noise, 3 men, brothers by blood, screaming over each other until their voices blurred into one ugly roar. Then the fragile daughter finally moved. She stood, shaking, her hands pressed to her chest. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but in the chaos, it was enough to cut through. She told them to stop. She begged them, and in that instant, the room shifted. Her plea was not met with relief, but with fury. The eldest son turned on her, his face twisted with betrayal, as though her words had chosen sides. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to leave marks. She gasped, tried to pull away, but the movement only fueled the rage in the room. The second son lunged forward, shoving his brother hard enough to send him crashing into the wall. The fragile daughter stumbled, nearly falling, before the third caught her, pulling her close as though he was protecting her. But even that gesture was a claim, another spark in the storm. The eldest roared and charged, fists flying, the sound of flesh against flesh filling the room. The fight was no longer just about her. It was about years of resentment, years of wounds that had never healed, years of silence that had turned into violence. The fragile daughter screamed then, a sound that tore through the walls, high and sharp and filled with terror. She tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room was too small, the men too wild. One grabbed her arm, another pulled her back, each one convinced he was saving her, when in truth they were breaking her. Her voice, he cracked as she begged them to let go, her words drowned by the crash of bodies, the shouts of brothers who no longer saw her as a sister, but as a prize. The breaking point came fast. The eldest son, blinded by rage, grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the stove. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wide and unfocused, his grip white-knuckled. He raised it high, his voice hoarse with fury. For a split second, the room froze, his brothers staring, the fragile daughter sobbing, the mother unmoving in her chair. Then the iron came down. The sound of its striking was sickening, a dull crack that seemed to echo far louder than the walls should have allowed. The fragile daughter crumpled to the floor, her body folding in on itself. Her cry cut off mid-breath. Blood spread across the boards, dark and fast, the smell of iron filling the room. The silence that followed was worse than the screams had been. The brothers stood frozen, their chests heaving, eyes locked on the motionless body at their feet. Their rage drained in an instant, replaced by shock, horror, and a dawning realization of what they had done. The eldest still held the poker, his hand trembling, his eyes fixed on the red stain spreading across the wood. The second son whispered her name, over and over, his voice breaking, his knees buckling beneath him. The third backed away, shaking his head, his hands covered in blood from where he had tried to catch her. Their mother rose slowly from her chair. She looked down at the girl, her expression still unreadable. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She only stared for a long moment before lifting her eyes to her son's. "You will not speak of this," she said, her voice low, steady. Do you hear me?" Not a word. The brothers stammered, their voices shaking, but none of them dared defy her. Panic surged through them, their minds scrambling for answers, excuses, anything to undo what had just happened. But the body on the floor made it clear there was no undoing it. The fragile daughter, the one who had carried all their storms, was gone. The immediate aftermath was chaos wrapped in silence. The second son tried to shake her awake, his hands frantic, his sobs choking his words. The eldest dropped the poker, staring at his blood-stained hands as though they belonged to someone else. The third paced the room, muttering, cursing, clawing at his hair. Their mother's calm cut through their panic like a blade. She told them to clean the floor. She told them to move the body. She told them that nothing had changed, that life in the farmhouse would go on, but everything had changed. The brothers moved in a daze, their hands shaking as they carried her to the back room, their hearts pounding so hard it hurt. The air was thick with the smell of blood, the sound of their ragged breathing. They couldn't look at each other. They couldn't look at her. They worked in silence, their minds screaming with questions they didn't dare ask. When it was done, they sat in the main room again, the stove crackling weakly, the board scrubbed but still stained. The fragile daughter was gone, but her absence filled every corner of the house. The brothers avoided each other's eyes. Their mother sat in her chair, her face calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She told them again, silence. They nodded, broken, teach. EIR bodies trembling, their souls fractured, and outside. The cold wind howled against the walls, carrying their secret into the night. The farmhouse fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to suffocate everyone inside. After the blood was cleaned and her body hidden away in the back room, the family tried to carry on as though nothing had happened. But the silence wasn't the same anymore. It was no longer the silence of secrecy. It was the silence of death, of guilt that pressed on every breath, of a truth too big to bury. The eldest son could not rid himself of the image of her crumpling to the floor. He would sit at the table, staring at the boards where the stain had been, his hands trembling though he tried to keep them still. At night, when the house went quiet, he would hear the sound again, the crack of iron on bone, the gas cut short. He told himself it had been an accident, that his brothers had pushed him to it, that it wasn't his fault. But the excuses didn't hold for long. In the dark, he felt her eyes on him, unblinking, accusing. He drank more, trying to numb the thoughts, but the drink only made them louder. The second son slipped into denial. He refused to speak of it, refused to acknowledge it even when the weight was unbearable. If anyone asked, he said nothing had happened, that his sister was simply gone. In his mind, if he didn't say it out loud, it wasn't real. Yet he couldn't escape the sound of her voice, the way she had begged them to stop, the way her body had gone limp in his arms. He carried that moment with him like a stone lodged in his chest. The third son was consumed by panic. He could not stay still, could not sleep, could not breathe without the memory clawing at him. He paced the halls at night, muttering to himself, pulling at his hair, as though movement alone could keep the guilt from devouring him. He saw her in every corner of the house, imagined her shadow in the doorway, her figure sitting where she once had. The others told him to quiet down, but he couldn't. His fears spilled out into the open, his nerves fraying more with each day that passed. Their mother remained the calmest, at least on the surface. She insisted that nothing had changed, that silence was survival, that they had weathered storms before and would again. She spoke with authority, her words final, but even she carried the weight in ways she could not hide. Sometimes she would sit staring into the stove, her face blank, her hands twisting in her lap as though she were holding something invisible. She had raised her children to obey, to never question, to keep their lives contained within those walls. But she had not prepared for this. The final proof of what her silence and control had created. Outside the house, whispers began to spread. The fragile daughter had not been seen in town for weeks. Children in school asked where she had gone. Neighbors noticed her absence on the porch, where she sometimes sat in the evenings. At first, the family explained it away. She was sick, she was resting. She had gone to visit a cousin. But the stories didn't match, and people began to talk. In small towns, nothing stayed hidden for long without a teacher. Remembering the girl's quiet presence and sudden disappearance raised concerns. A neighbor mentioned to another that they hadn't seen her in far too long. Slowly, questions reached the ears of the authorities. A deputy came by one afternoon, knocking on the sagging door, his hand resting on his belt. The family answered calmly, the matriarch speaking for them as always, her voice steady, her face unreadable. She told the deputy her daughter had gone to stay with relatives, that she was fine, and that there was no need for concern. The deputy nodded, his eyes scanning their pale faces, the dark rooms behind them. He left, but his unease lingered. The community's suspicion grew. The family had always been strange, always been whispered about, but now the whispers grew sharper. People wondered aloud what went on inside that farmhouse. They spoke of curses, of madness, of things no one dared say too loudly. The family, once ignored, now stood at the center of attention, their every move watched. And the more they tried to hide, the more obvious their silence became. The emotional toll inside the house only worsened. The brothers turned on each other, their guilt twisting into blame. The eldest accused the others of provoking him, of forcing his hand. The second said it was the eldest's rage that had killed her, not their arguments. The third shouted that they had all been guilty, that none of them had tried hard enough to stop it. Their words became weapons, each brother lashing out, each one trying to shed the weight of guilt onto the others. Their mother tried to keep control, but her voice no longer held the same authority. The cracks in her rule were showing, and the children she had bound so tightly were now unraveling. The house, once bound by silence, was filled with shouting, weeping, and the sound of doors slamming until the frames splintered. The weight of the crime had torn away what little stability they had left. The fragile daughter's absence echoed far beyond the farmhouse. In town, people remembered her soft voice, her downcast eyes, the way she never seemed to belong even when she stood among others. For some, her disappearance was just another tragedy in a place where hardship was common. For others, it was proof of what they had always suspected, that something dark lived in that family, that secrets too ugly to speak had finally come to light. The guilt within the farmhouse never left. It poisoned their meals, their sleep, their every word. At night, when the wind howled against the walls, they swore they could hear her voice, faint but sharp, calling for them. The youngest children cried in their beds, asking where she had gone, their innocent questions twisting the knife deeper. No one answered them in the months that followed. The farmhouse became darker, both inside and out. Curtains stayed drawn, the porch stayed empty, and the family was more withdrawn than ever. The land around them grew wild, weeds choking what once had been fields, vines curling up the walls as though the earth itself wanted to reclaim the house. Visitors stopped coming altogether, leaving the family alone with their secret. But secrets have a way of rotting everything they touch. The eldest grew more violent, lashing out at his brothers, his fists carrying the weight of his guilt. The second sank deeper into denial, his silence becoming dangerous, his mind closing itself off until he was little more than a shell. The third grew more frantic, his nerves snapping like brittle twigs, his body restless, his mind unraveling. And the mother, still seated in her chair, began to look less like a leader and more like a prisoner of the world she had created. The town did not forget. The whispers only grew. And though the family told themselves they could carry on, that silence could hold back the truth forever, deep down they all knew the same thing. The truth had already escaped. It lived in the cracks of their walls, in the eyes of their neighbors, in the restless nights when a fragile daughter's ghost seemed to move through the house. The crime had not only taken her life, it had hollowed out the family, leaving behind nothing but guilt, suspicion, and the slow, inevitable collapse of everything they had tried to protect. The farmhouse did not last much longer after the fragile daughter's disappearance. Secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of bleeding into the world. It began with whispers, then suspicions, then questions that could no longer be brushed away. People in town started asking louder. Where is she? Why hasn't anyone seen her? The family's excuses grew weaker with time, their silence becoming its confession. Eventually, the law returned. Not a single deputy this time, but several men, their cars pulling up the dirt road in a cloud of dust. Neighbors stood at a distance, watching as officers stepped onto the porch, their voices firm, their faces grim. The family resisted at first, their mother insisting nothing was wrong. Her sons tried to intimidate the men into Leah. Ving. But the weight of suspicion was too heavy now. The search began, and it didn't take long. Behind the house, in a shallow patch of earth hastily covered, they found what they had feared. The fragile daughter's body lay buried beneath dirt and stone, her bones fractured, her features barely recognizable. The discovery rippled through the community like a lightning strike. The rumors that had once been dismissed as cruel gossip were now confirmed in the worst way imaginable. The farmhouse was no longer a place of mystery. It was a crime scene. The arrest followed swiftly. The eldest son, his hands shaking as they cuffed him, stared at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The second son muttered denial even as he was led away, his voice frantic, insisting they had it wrong, that none of it had happened. The third son screamed as they dragged him from the porch, his body thrashing, his mind fractured beyond reason. And the mother, silent as ever, walked calmly between the officers, her face blank, her steps steady, as though she had always known this moment would come. The trial drew attention far beyond the small town. Reporters filled the courtroom, their pens scratching furiously as each detail of the family's life spilled out. The story was too grotesque, too tragic, to ignore. A family torn apart by secrecy, isolation, and twisted loyalties. The prosecution painted a picture of control and silence, of a matriarch who had ruled her children with fear, of brothers whose jealousy and rage had ended in blood. The defense tried to argue poverty, desperation, a lack of outside intervention, but the evidence spoke louder. The eldest son was convicted of murder, his face hollow as the verdict was read. The second and third were sentenced as accomplices, their roles in the violence too clear to deny. The mother, though she hadn't wielded the weapon, was found guilty as well, for her silence, for her control, for creating a house where such a crime could happen and be hidden. Justice, in the eyes of the court, had been served. But in truth, no justice could bring back the fragile daughter whose life had been stolen by the people meant to protect her. The farmhouse stood empty after that, its windows broken, its walls caving in, the land around it reclaiming what was left. No one wanted it. No one dare move in. Children dared each other to run up to the porch, but even the bravest never stayed long. The house had become a symbol, a reminder of what silence can breed, of what secrets can destroy. For the community, the crime was a wound that did not heal quickly. People questioned how they had looked the other way for so long, how they had dismissed the signs, how they had allowed a family to slip so far into darkness without stepping in. Teachers spoke of the girl in hushed voices, remembering the quiet child who had once sat in their classrooms. Neighbors confessed their unease, their guilt for not doing more when the whispers grew too loud to ignore. The town carried its share of the burden, the realization that silence was not only inside that farmhouse. It was outside, too, in the eyes that looked away. The fragile daughter's death forced larger questions into the open. About power, how one voice can dominate a household, and how that dominance can warp love into something unrecognizable. About morality, how family, the very bond meant to protect, can be twisted into control, jealousy, and violence. About society, how poverty, isolation, and neglect create cracks wide enough for tragedies to fall through. Her story was not just about one family. It was about the ways silence and denial allow suffering to grow unchecked, about the human tendency to avoid what is uncomfortable until it is too late. For the family members left behind, life was no longer their own. The eldest son wasted away in prison, his body still strong, but his eyes vacant, haunted by the moment his rage turned into irreversible action. The second spent his days muttering to himself, lost in denial, still insisting she was alive somewhere, that none of it had been real. The third broke completely, his mind shattering, his screams echoing through prison walls at night. Their mother remained calm, even behind bars, never once admitting fault, never once showing remorse. For her, control had been everything, and even stripped of freedom, she clung to silence like it was her last weapon. In the end, the fragile daughter became the only one remembered with tenderness. Her name was spoken in town, her absence felt at every gathering, her memory carried by those who had once seen her walking quietly to school, head bowed, hands clasped. She became the symbol of what had been lost, of what should never have happened, of the cost of silence. This tragedy revealed more than just a single crime. It showed the fragility of family bonds when twisted by control and fear. It showed the dangers of isolation, how cutting oneself off from the world leaves room for shadows to grow unchecked. And it showed how society often looks away from its most vulnerable until the damage is beyond repair. Justice was served in the eyes of the law, but justice does not mend broken lives. It cannot return a stolen childhood. It cannot erase the memory of screams in the night. What remained was a story that haunted not just a family, not just a town, but anyone who heard it. A reminder that evil does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it grows inside the very walls meant to keep us safe.